A Guten Erev Shabbos. It's customary on the Shabbat preceding Pesach, or sometimes the Shabbos prior to that, to look a bit more deeply into some of the halachos and meanings of the Seder and the Haggadah to enrich our experience of the holiday. Thankfully, there's no end to questions and discussions of the rich and deep understandings within every step and really every word of the Haggadah, so we'll always have plenty to talk about. As it says in the Haggadah itself, even if we were all chachamim, nevonim, zakenim, yodem es Torah, if we were all wise and understanding, experienced sages, it would still be a mitzvah, meaning we would still be able to connect in a very meaningful way to our own people's story. In fact, the intention this year, since Rosh Hashanah, was to devote more of the shiurim and drashas to delving into the depths of the Haggadah, and even have a half year's preparation by the time we got to the Seder. While that planning was in process, there were other forces in the world with their own plans, namely their intent to fulfill the awful truism of the Haggadah itself, that in every generation they stand ready to annihilate us, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu saves us from their hand. We say, Ela shebechol dor vador omdim aleinu lechalosenu v'HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzilenu miyadam. That's where we are right now, that our people and our land are still under threat. And now that we're in the month of Nisan, which is supposed to be the season of our freedom, we're still thinking every day about those 100+ of our people who are still not free, who are held hostage, in who can even imagine what kind of conditions. While that's been going on, more than 1,000 families have sat shiva for their relatives killed on and after the attacks of last Shmini Atzeres, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers have answered the call to duty in defense, and hundreds have not come home. Hopefully, by the time you hear these words, this will be history. The war would be over. The mortal enemies of Israel will come to the realization that they can live a better life by looking after their own people and feeding and educating them, rather than teaching them to hate Jews and spend all their resources building tunnels to attack us on our holidays. They will have realized the awful error of their ways and released the hostages alive and healthy back to the embrace of their families, as we have been praying for in our shul every day since the morning of Shmini Atzeres last fall. In the best possible world, the United Nations and all the other sterling examples of human rights around the globe, like Cuba, Indonesia, Iran, Pakistan, Russia, Syria, and South Africa, each its own model of a thriving democratic society with responsible, thoughtful, and peaceful leadership, will recognize the absurdity of their condemnations of Israel and ask forgiveness from the Jewish state and the Jewish people for their misguided stance in favor of terror and lawlessness, and will begin to set the record straight. Look, we have to imagine a better world, don't we? So on Pesach, when we sit down to the Seder with our families and our friends, matzah and wine and delicious food and old Haggadahs with wine stains, which I happen to love, we'll recline and we'll pour wine for one another in derech cherus, the representation of freedom. And we'll talk about liberation and how on that night, 3,300+ years ago, we became a free people. We will ask questions, we will dip twice, we will wash our hands, because we always remember that hands should be used for holy purposes to build a better world, not to build storage cities for Pharaoh, as we had previously been forced to do. And in the middle of it all, we will taste bitterness. We will eat bitter herbs, and we'll even make a bracha on that. We'll say a blessing, because every year that we've been at the Seder with our parents or even our grandparents, if we were so fortunate, we had to remember that part of redemption, part of freedom, part of the Exodus is the bitterness that comes before it. These last 50 or 60 or 70 years, many of us, the Jewish people, have moved toward more freedom, more opportunity, more success, more education, more safety and security. It's been good. Baruch Hashem, thank God. It was almost like we had to take a bite of horseradish to remind ourselves, it hasn't always been so good. Sometimes in the past, times got bitter, lest we forget. This year, we need no reminder. This year, even though we'll say in Shir Hamalos, Az Yamale Sechok Pinu, Psalm 126, then our mouths will be filled with song. We are tasting bitterness. Even though we speak about freedom, how can we feel freedom when our people sit as hostages, prisoners in some dark underground hole somewhere? How can we say, all who are hungry, come and eat, when we know that 130 of our brothers and sisters who cannot even hear our invitation, much less come and sit down at the table with us and join us for brisket and kugel and a good night of conversation about how valuable and precious freedom is. We're going to set an extra place for them at our table. Maybe you will too. But even though hopefully they will join their own families for the Seder, if not ours, in any case, we will all be eating some maror, some bitter herb at the Seder, because even in the best of times, we have a mitzvah to remember that sometimes things are bitter. In his Haggadah, Rabbi Reuven Feinstein notes that the Mishnah in Pesachim says the best type of vegetable to use for maror, the bitter herb, is chazeres, romaine lettuce. We'll note that you do have to check it for bugs, because there are a lot of bugs in romaine lettuce. Romaine is bitter, but it's not so bitter. God does not want us to suffer. That is so not the point. Then Rabbi Feinstein asks the bigger question. Why do we need to remember the bitterness at all? Why not just remember the good, the freedom, the liberation? He answers with a quote from Israeli slang that anyone's picked up, even if you were only in Israel for a short time. Hakol beseder. It's used to mean to say everything's okay. But one literal translation is everything. Hakol is in the Seder, the Seder. In our Seder, in our Passover Seder, there's singing and praising and storytelling and reclining and freedom in there, but there's also bitterness, because that's part of our experience too. And even more on chazeres, romaine lettuce. It's a vegetable that starts out sweet when it's young. Only later does it become bitter. Just as our experience in Egypt was like that. It started off with Pharaoh welcoming the father of Joseph. When Jacob came down, Yaakov came down to Mitzrayim, to Egypt, to be reunited with his long-lost son. And it says, Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim. Yaakov lived. He truly lived the best years of his life. Those last 17 years in Egypt with all of his family and children and grandchildren, including Serach bas Asher. A little golden age, if you will. Only when a new Pharaoh arose, who knew not Joseph, did the bitterness and enslavement and suffering begin. And remember, that chapter of history turned on a dime, as it has so many other times in our long history of first being welcomed, and then tolerated, and then expelled, or worse. And there's a lesson in that too. Rabbi Twersky mentions an old Yiddish proverb in his Haggadah, that Avorim liegt in chrein und meint as es ken zissere nishta. A worm sits in horseradish and thinks there's no sweeter place to be. We get used to things. We start out tolerating the misery, and pretty soon it becomes home. It's what we get comfortable with. He tells the story of a woman from the old country writing to her son who moved to America. She hired a scribe to write the letter for her because she couldn't write it herself. So she dictated, "Dear son, I hope you are well. Thank God, I'm well too. We had a cold winter, and I couldn't afford much firewood, but thank God, I was able to keep the wind out by stuffing rags in the cracks in the wall. Winter's over now, and when it rains, the roof leaks, but thank God, I've been able to patch it with some tin. Food is expensive now, but thank God, I found a place that sells day-old bread very cheaply. Our cow stopped giving milk, but thank God I was able to sell it for slaughter. We'll manage somehow, with God's help." So the scribe who's writing all this down decides he's going to edit the letter a little bit as he goes. maybe to encourage the son to send some money. So he writes like this. He writes in the letter, "Dear son, I hope you're doing well in America, and I can't understand why you haven't helped me. During the harsh winter, I had to stuff rags in the cracks to keep out the wind. But without a fire in the fireplace, the house was freezing. Now that winter's over, the roof leaks, and all we have to eat is stale bread. The cow stopped giving milk, and I barely have enough to survive." So the scribe reads the letter back to the mother, and she claps her hands to her head in grief. She says, "Oy vey, I didn't realize how bad off I was." Rav Kook wants us to remember that Rabban Gamliel says in the Haggadah that if you didn't talk about three things, Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, the bitter herb, you missed the whole point of the Seder. The Korban Pesach, the Pesach offering, is about the unity and uniqueness of the Jewish people, which we have to understand and appreciate. The Matzah is the redemption that allowed us to live pure Jewish lives and develop as a nation. And the Maror is to tell us that we should not fear suffering. In the times of Egypt, most probably Rav Kook would say even today, suffering is part of our national destiny, but not as an end in itself, not suffering in itself. No one wants that, certainly not God. But we learn to adapt from the suffering and we develop, we become stronger and closer together as a nation. We turn the bitterness into redemption and freedom. That's the lesson. Similarly, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav talks about the tranquility we have when we know that God is with us always, even in the bitterness, the sadness, and the darkness. In fact, he writes, we would not appreciate it. We would not even know it if we didn't experience bitterness before the sweetness of freedom and deliverance. Just as we cannot treasure light without knowing what it's like to sit in the dark. He says, for the Gematria fans, that Maror is the Gematria, the letters of the same numerological value, as Mavet, death. We have a taste of that bitterness, but we taste it through Chasa, through romaine lettuce, which is the same Gematria as Chayim, life. That's how we come to treasure it as all part of the same experience. The bitterness, Rabbi Nachman says, is a sign of the divine concealment. Not everything is readily understood by us. Some of it's hidden. We have to chew the maror, taste some bitterness, to realize that we're confused, and maybe it's time to turn to God. Chasa, by the way, has the word chas in it, which means mercy, says the Abarbanel in Zevach Pesach. Even in the bitterness, or from the bitterness, because of it, God has Rahmanas on us. Be'er Mayim Chaim comments on the verse, Vayimararu es chayehem. They embittered their lives, meaning the Egyptians made it harder on themselves too. The Alexander Rebbe explains the extra misery that the Egyptians placed upon us made the Jewish people cry out in desperation to God, which wound up taking 190 years off the 400-year decree that we were to be enslaved in a land that was not ours. So the Egyptians leaned into the oppressor thing, and it made it worse for them. We got out 2 centuries early. Think about that. Dr. Erica Brown, in her Seder Talk Haggadah, gives the recipe for turning bitterness, or starting to turn bitterness into something sweet. You'll remember that we dip or dab a little bit of charosas on the maror before we eat it to make it a little bit more palatable. Don't ever get caught up in the bitterness, she writes. Some people can get so stuck in the bitter phase that they live it, eat it, and breathe bitterness. That is not the point at all. At the same time, the whole maror moment in the Haggadah is specifically a recipe not to get caught in the victim mentality. After being slaves for so long, we might have become so embittered that we could never move past it. So we take a bite of maror, maybe our eyes water, maybe we cough, but then we start to clear up and we move on. There's definitely bitterness and pain, but we have to get through it and move on to other things and not retain the slave mentality or get stuck in the victim mindset. Says the Chidushei Harim, we were not ready for redemption until we could actually taste the bitterness of exile. Maror, the bitter herb, symbolizes the moment when we realized just how bitter it was to be debased as slaves. That realization itself, the ability to taste, was the first spark of redemption. The sensation of taste, the sensation of taste, a sign of renewed life, such that the process of tasting the bitterness is actually part of the process of redemption. Rav Raimon from the Gush writes that we acknowledge with every difficulty that we grow, and every struggle reveals the power within ourselves to continue focusing with joy and abundant good. Finally, listen to Rabbi Lamb's beautiful formulation in his Haggadah. Quote, but the message of Maror is more than just the awareness of the bittersweet taste of life, more than just the idea that every black cloud has a silver lining. What Maror wants to tell us is that misery is not meaningless. Pain is not pointless punishment, that human anguish has larger dimensions, that the bitter leads to the sweet. In fact, without the foretaste of Maror, Charoset loses its value. There can be no sweet without bitter, no light without darkness before it, no joy without prior sadness. There can be no wealth without poverty, no faith without doubt, no freedom without slavery, no redemption without exile. A people that dips maror into charoset and makes a bracha over it is defeated neither by fate nor by foe. A folk that can find the mellow in a morsel of misery can drive away the darkness with its own light, the outer sorrow with the inner joy. End of quote. May our inner joy of this holiday illuminate the darkness of our times and shine with the light of and until the end of days. Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach.